Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Before we begin, it's important to clarify. This video is a work of fiction inspired by folklore. Characters and events have been creatively adapted. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. We do not encourage or depict dangerous practices. Comment where you're watching from right now. Has anyone here ever been to the Appalachian Mountains? Because what we're about to discover happened right there, at a time when civilization was still struggling to penetrate those fog-shrouded slopes. The Appalachian Mountains have always carried an aura of isolation, endless chains of peaks covered by dense forests, deep valleys where the sun rarely reached the ground, and communities so distant from one another that weeks could pass without a neighbor visiting another. It was 1903, and even with the new century bringing promises of progress, there were places where time seemed frozen in a previous era. In Western Virginia, near the Kentucky border, there was a region known locally as the Forgotten Valleys. It wasn't an official name you'd find on maps of the time, but everyone who lived in those mountains knew exactly what it was. These valleys were so remote that even mail carriers avoided their trails. The families who lived there were self-sufficient for everything, from food to justice. Lucinda Harwell lived in one of those valleys. She wasn't born there. According to the few records that survived in dusty county archives, Lucinda came from somewhere east, perhaps the Carolinas, perhaps coastal Virginia itself. No one knew for sure. What we do know is that she arrived in those mountains as a stranger, and strangers in Appalachia were rarely welcome. The cabin where Lucinda lived was at the southern end of a narrow valley, surrounded by ancient fir and oak trees. It was a modest structure, made of logs and mud, with a single chimney that released thin smoke during the cold months. Around it, nothing but silence and the constant presence of the forest. The nearest trail was almost an hour's walk away, and the most accessible settlement, a cluster of houses called Hollow Creek, was more than 10 kilometers away. Lucinda lived alone, which was already cause for suspicion. Solitary women in remote places always aroused curiosity, and often fear. There were rumors, of course. There were always rumors. Some said she talked to the forest, that she knew herbs and roots that cured impossible diseases. Others whispered that she practiced something more obscure, rituals learned in distant lands, secrets passed down through generations of women who knew the hidden ways of nature. But Lucinda rarely went down to Hollow Creek. When she did, it was only to trade medicinal herbs for flour, salt, or kerosene. She spoke little, kept her eyes downcast, and returned to her valley before the sun began to set. The villagers watched her with suspicion, but did not confront her. There was something about her that commanded respect, or perhaps it was disguised fear. In the fall of 1903, something began to change. Residents of Hollow Creek noticed that Lucinda hadn't been seen for weeks. This wouldn't be unusual, especially with the arrival of the cold weather, but there was something different in the air. Hunters passing near her valley reported strange lights at night, bluish glows dancing among the trees. Others swore they heard singing, female voices in melodies that didn't belong to any church or known tradition. A farmer named Elias Pemberton was the first to express genuine concern. He owned property on the edge of the valley where Lucinda lived, and one morning he found 3 of his sheep dead near the creek that divided his land. The animals were intact, with no signs of predators, but their eyes were wide open in an expression of frozen terror. Elias reported this at the Hollow Creek store, and the word began to spread. It was then that Margaret Foss, one of the few women who occasionally visited Lucinda to buy medicine, decided to climb up to the cabin. Margaret was respected in the community, a middle-aged widow raising 4 children alone, and unafraid to tackle the mountain trails. She set off on a clear October morning, promising to return before nightfall. Margaret did not return. The next day, her eldest son, Thomas, followed her up. He found the trail without difficulty, following the marks he had known since childhood. But when he reached Lucinda's cabin, what he saw made him recoil immediately. The door was open, swaying slightly in the wind. Inside, everything seemed in order, but there was a heavy, almost tangible silence, and on the hard-packed earthen floor, near the unlit fireplace, was a single muddy footprint that belonged to neither of the 2 women. Thomas ran back to Hollow Creek and gathered a group of men. They climbed up armed, carrying lanterns and ropes, prepared for the worst. When they reached the cabin, the scene was even more disturbing. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, not a drop of blood. But both Lucinda and Margaret had disappeared. What they found, however, was something no one expected: a notebook. It was on the rustic wooden table, open to a page covered in tight slanted handwriting. The words were in English, but written in a coded way, with interspersed symbols that no one could fully decipher. What they could read was enough to chill anyone's blood. The notebook contained notes about the forest, about the cycles of the moon, about plants that grew only at certain times of the year. There were drawings of intertwined routes, rudimentary maps of trails that no one knew, and names. Dozens of names written in columns, some crossed out, others circled. Among them, the name Margaret Foss appeared underlined 3 times. The men from Hollow Creek took the notebook back to the village. For days, they tried to understand what it meant. The county sheriff, a man named William Thatcher, was summoned. He came from Parksville, the nearest larger town, located almost 30 kilometers away. Thatcher examined the notebook, spoke with the residents, and organized searches of the surrounding valleys. The search lasted 2 weeks. Groups of men scoured every trail, every clearing, every stream that cut through those mountains. They found only silence, not a scrap of clothing, not a clue to indicate where the 2 women might have gone. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed them up. During this period, something else began to happen. Residents of Hollow Creek reported disturbing dreams. Dreams where they walked through the forest at night and encountered hooded figures in a circle, singing in unknown languages. Others dreamed of Lucinda, standing in the middle of a clearing, staring directly at them without blinking, her lips moving in words that produced no sound. A woman named Ruth Cassidy woke up screaming in the middle of the night, swearing she had seen Margaret Foss standing beside her bed. According to Ruth, Margaret was soaked, as if she had just come out of a river, and kept repeating the same phrase. She showed us the way. When Ruth lit the lamp, there was no one there, but the wooden floor beside the bed was wet. Fear began to take hold in Hollow Creek. Families locked their doors and windows at nightfall. No one ventured up into the valleys alone anymore. The warehouse, once a lively meeting place, now received only quick, silent visits. People spoke in hushed voices, always glancing over their shoulders, as if expecting something or someone to be listening. It was in this tense atmosphere that a stranger appeared. He arrived in Hollow Creek on a grey November afternoon in 1903, riding a dark horse and carrying a worn leather suitcase. He said his name was Samuel Harding and that he was a researcher of mountain folklore. He traveled through the Appalachians collecting old stories, forgotten legends, and accounts of unexplained phenomena. Samuel heard about the disappearance in a Parksville newspaper. The news item was small, just a paragraph in the bottom corner of the page, but it was enough to pique his interest. He settled into Hollow Creek's only boarding house, a modest home run by an elderly woman named Abigail Porter, and began asking questions. The residents initially resisted. They didn't want a stranger meddling in something that was already disturbing enough, but Samuel had a persuasive way of speaking. He didn't judge, he just listened, and little by little, people began to tell what they knew, what they suspected, what they feared. It was through these conversations that Samuel discovered something crucial. Lucinda Harwell was not the first solitary woman to live in that valley. Decades earlier, in the 1870s, another woman had lived in the exact same spot. Her name was Constance Vale, and according to the elders, she too practiced dark arts. Constance had mysteriously disappeared during a harsh winter, and her cabin remained abandoned for years until Lucinda appeared and claimed it. Even more intriguing was the fact that, before Constance, there were vague records of another woman in the same valley, and before her, another, as if that specific place attracted a certain type of person, or perhaps as if something in that valley demanded a female presence to remain in balance. Samuel spent days examining Lucinda's notebook. He recognized some of the symbols as belonging to ancient European traditions, practices that had been brought to America by immigrants from remote regions of Scotland and Ireland. But there were other symbols he had never seen, designs that seemed a mixture of different traditions, something unique that had been developed there, in those isolated mountains. One night, while studying his notebook by candlelight in his room at the boarding house, Samuel noticed something peculiar. When he held certain pages up to the light, almost invisible watermarks appeared. They were maps, detailed maps of a specific area of the valley where Lucinda lived, with one point marked repeatedly, a rock formation known locally as Crow's Rock. The next morning, Samuel announced he would climb to Raven Rock. No one wanted to accompany him. The rock formation had a bad reputation among the locals. They said that thousands of ravens gathered there during certain times of the year, creating a dark cloud that blocked the sun. They also said that people who spent a lot of time near those rocks returned changed. Speaking of visions and whispers they couldn't forget, Samuel set off alone at dawn. He took provisions for 2 days, a compass, paper and pencil for notes, and Lucinda's notebook carefully kept in his bag. The trail was steep and treacherous, winding between ancient trees whose branches formed such a dense canopy that even at midday it seemed like twilight. He reached Raven Rock in the late afternoon. The formation was impressive, 3 gigantic rocks stacked in a seemingly impossible way, creating a kind of natural arch. The silence there was absolute. No wind, no birds, not even the distant sound of running water, just a heavy silence that pressed against the ears. It was then that Samuel saw the markings, carved into the rocks, almost erased by time and erosion, were symbols identical to those in Lucinda's notebook. They formed a circular pattern around the base of the stones, as if delimiting a sacred or forbidden space. And in the center of that circle there was an opening, a narrow crack in the rock that descended into the darkness. Samuel turned on his flashlight and approached the opening. The air rising from it was cold, and carried a smell of damp earth mixed with something he couldn't identify. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was strange, primitive, as if that smell had existed since before humans arrived in those mountains. He hesitated. The opening was too narrow to descend safely alone, especially without knowing what lay beneath. Samuel decided to camp right there, beside Raven Rock, and return to Hollow Creek in the morning to seek help. As night fell, he pitched a small tent and lit a fire using dry branches he found scattered on the ground. The night in the Appalachian Mountains had a particular weight to it. It wasn't just the physical darkness, but something deeper, as if the forest itself were watching. Samuel tried to focus on his notes, reviewing the symbols in his notebook and comparing them to what he had seen on the rocks. They matched perfectly, but this only raised more questions. How long had those marks been there? Who had made them? And why did Lucinda recognize those same symbols? Around midnight, Samuel heard something. It was a distant sound like a chant, female voices intertwined in a melody that rose and fell at irregular intervals. He left the tent, holding his lantern, and looked around. The forest was still, but the sound continued, coming from somewhere below, possibly from that crack in the rock. Samuel was not a superstitious man. He had spent years studying phenomena that others called supernatural, always finding rational explanations. But there, alone in those mountains in 1903, with that chant echoing in the darkness, he felt something he rarely experienced, genuine doubt about what was real and what was not. The sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the singing. Samuel returned to his tent but couldn't sleep. He lay there listening to every little noise in the forest, every crackling branch, every furtive movement in the shadows beyond the reach of his campfire's light. When the sun finally rose, Samuel quickly packed up and began to descend the trail back to Hollow Creek. But something was different. The trail he had climbed the day before seemed altered. Trees he was sure he had passed were now in slightly different positions. Markings he had made on tree trunks to avoid getting lost had disappeared. It was as if the forest itself had rearranged itself overnight. He continued downhill, trusting his compass and the angle of the sun. After several hours of walking, Samuel finally spotted smoke rising from the trees. It was Hollow Creek. But when he reached the village, he found an unexpected scene. People were gathered in front of the store talking loudly, and there were unfamiliar horses tied to the posts. Samuel approached and discovered that, during his absence, another person had disappeared. This time, it was a young man named Jacob Turner who had gone hunting and had not returned. His wife, Caroline, was in tears, being comforted by other women. Deputy Thatcher had returned, bringing with him 2 deputies from Parksville. Thatcher recognized Samuel and pulled him aside. He wanted to know what the researcher had discovered at Ravenstone. Samuel told him about the opening in the rock, the symbols, the night chant. Thatcher listened in silence, his face hardening with each word. The sheriff then revealed something he hadn't shared with the residents. In the county archives in Parksville, he had found records of similar disappearances over the decades. There weren't many, maybe 1 or 2 every 10 years, but they all shared a pattern. They always happened in the fall, always near that specific valley, and the people simply vanished without a trace. Even more disturbing, Thatcher had discovered an 1847 document written by a Methodist missionary who had visited the region. The missionary reported the existence of an isolated community in the mountains that practiced rituals he described as contrary to Christian teachings. According to the account, these people believed that the mountains required periodic offerings to remain at peace, and that wise women were chosen to mediate between the human world and that which dwelt in the depths of the earth. Samuel and Thatcher decided to organize a larger expedition to Ravenstone. They gathered a group of 7 men, all armed and equipped with ropes, lanterns, and provisions. They set off the next day, under a heavy sky of low clouds that promised rain. The climb was tense. No one spoke much. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, wondering what they might find. When they finally reached the rock formation, the group stopped, observing that impossible structure of stacked stones. Thatcher was the first to approach the crevice. They tied ropes to nearby trees and prepared a descent system. One of the men, an experienced miner named Peter Hale, volunteered to go down first. He had experience exploring caves and tunnels and did not seem intimidated by the darkness that awaited below. Peter descended slowly, his flashlight swaying and casting dancing shadows on the rock walls. The men above held the rope, alert for any sign of danger. The descent was deeper than they had expected. 3 meters, 5 meters, 8 meters. Finally, the rope slackened, indicating that Peter had reached the bottom. His voice echoed from below, muffled by the distance. "There's a chamber here. It's big, very big." One by one, the men descended. Samuel was one of the last, followed only by Thatcher. When his feet touched the rocky ground and he raised his lantern, what he saw left him speechless. They were in a natural cave, but it was no ordinary cave. The walls were covered in ancient paintings, made with pigments that still retained vibrant colors despite the humidity and time. The images showed human figures in circles, hands raised to the sky, and in the center of many of the drawings, a form that could be interpreted as a woman, but with features that were not entirely human. On the cave floor, arranged in circular patterns, were objects: polished stones, small animal bones, clay pots containing dry substances that could have been herbs or ashes, and in the center of it all, a long extinguished fire, its ashes still forming a perfect mound. But what caught their attention the most was what lay beyond the campfire, a narrow passage that led even deeper into the mountain. The passage was low, forcing the men to stoop to advance. The walls were damp, covered in moss that glistened faintly in the lantern light. The air there was different, denser, laden with a moisture that clung to the skin and made breathing difficult. Peter Hale led the way, his experience as a miner making him the most suitable to lead the group through that confined space. They walked for approximately 50 meters, until the passage opened into another chamber. This one was smaller than the previous one, but equally intriguing. The walls here were smooth, almost polished, as if generations of human hands had touched them repeatedly, and there were niches carved into the rock, small rectangular spaces containing carefully arranged objects. Samuel approached one of the niches and examined its contents. There was a rag doll so old that the fabric was almost falling apart. Next to it, a wooden comb with a few strands of hair still caught between its teeth, a small, broken mirror, a tiny Bible, no bigger than the palm of a hand. Each niche seemed to represent a person, a life, a story. Thatcher counted the niches. There were 23 of them, 23 lives represented in that hidden chamber in the heart of the mountain. The delegate felt a chill run down his spine. Did each niche represent someone who had disappeared over the years? Decades of people swallowed up by that mystery. At the back of the chamber, there was another passage, even narrower than the previous one. But this time, one of the men refused to go further. He said he felt something was wrong, a presence that made him want to leave immediately. Another man agreed, his trembling voice revealing genuine fear. Thatcher decided that only he, Samuel, and Peter would continue. The others would remain in that chamber awaiting his return. The 3 men pressed on. The passage seemed endless, winding through the solid rock, descending gradually. Samuel tried to gauge how deep they were, but he had lost all sense of direction. All he knew was that they kept descending, deeper and deeper, into the bowels of the mountain. Finally, the passage ended in a chamber that took the 3 men's breath away. It was vast, with a ceiling so high that their lanterns couldn't reach the highest point. And in the center was a natural rock formation that resembled an altar. On it were more recent objects, a still intact wicker basket, a woolen shawl that Samuel immediately recognized as belonging to one of the women of Hollow Creek, and what appeared to be a leather-bound book. Samuel picked up the book with trembling hands. It wasn't an ordinary book, but a diary. And on the first page, written in faded ink, was a name, Constance Vale, the woman who had lived in the valley before Lucinda, the one who had disappeared in the 1870s. He flipped through the pages quickly, his flashlight illuminating words written in an elegant but uneven handwriting, as if the writer were always in a hurry or under strong emotion. Constance described visions, dreams where she walked through the mountain and encountered something she called the Guardian. She wrote about voices that guided her, about ancient knowledge that surfaced in her mind without her knowing where it came from. One particular passage made Samuel pause. "Today I understood my purpose. I am not a prisoner of this place, but its protector. There is something here that must not be disturbed, something that sleeps in the depths and needs constant vigilance. Those who came before me understood this. Now it is my turn to maintain the balance." Thatcher found more objects scattered around the room. There were neatly folded clothes, shoes lined up against a wall, and what appeared to be offerings: dried fruit, bread hardened by time, empty ceramic jugs. It was as if someone had been there recently, maintaining that place, taking care of it. Then they heard it, a sound that came from somewhere deeper, beyond that chamber. It wasn't the chant Samuel had heard on the surface, but something different. A steady murmur like running water, but with a quality that wasn't entirely natural. There was rhythm in that sound, a pulse reminiscent of slow, deep breathing. Peter was the first to move toward the sound. He found another passage, this time so narrow that it was necessary to pass sideways. The three men exchanged glances. They had come so far that returning without discovering the source of that sound seemed unthinkable. But at the same time, each of them felt that they were approaching something that perhaps should not be found. Thatcher made the decision. They would only go as far as the passage allowed. If it became too dangerous, they would return immediately. The three squeezed through the narrow crevice, their lanterns casting distorted shadows on the rocky walls. The passage opened abruptly, and they found themselves in a smaller, almost intimate chamber. And there finally they found something that would completely change their understanding of what was happening in those mountains. There was a body, but it wasn't in the state they would have expected to find it. It had been preserved, naturally mummified by the conditions of the cave. The woman was sitting against the wall, dressed in clothing from an earlier period, perhaps the mid-1800s. Her hands were crossed over her lap, and her face held an expression of absolute peace. Beside her, another body, and another, and yet another. 5 women in total, all in similar positions, all with the same serene expression. It was as if they had chosen that place for their final rest, as if they had descended there voluntarily and simply decided to remain. Samuel knelt before the first figure. He did not touch her, only observed her with respect and growing understanding. These were the guardians Constance had mentioned in her diary, women who over generations had taken on the role of protecting something in those mountains. And when their time was up, they came to that chamber and joined those who came before. But where were Lucinda and Margaret? Where was Jacob Turner, the hunter who had recently disappeared? The answer came when Peter noticed yet another passage, almost invisible behind the seated figures. It was the smallest of all, little more than a crack in the rock. Thatcher hesitated. Every fiber of his being told him to retreat, to get off that mountain and never return. But he was the county marshal, responsible for finding the missing. He couldn't simply abandon the search when they had finally come so close to answers. Peter volunteered to go first again. The crevice was so tight that he had to leave his backpack behind, taking only his flashlight. He squeezed through the opening and disappeared for a few moments that seemed like an eternity. Then his voice echoed back, muffled but clear. "You need to see this." Samuel and Thatcher followed, one at a time. The crevice led to what could only be described as a natural chamber of astonishing beauty. The ceiling was covered in crystalline formations that reflected the light from the lanterns in 1,000 different directions, creating an almost celestial effect. And in the center, there was an underground lake of perfectly still water, so clear that it seemed possible to see all the way to the bottom. But it wasn't the lake that had caught Peter's attention. On the opposite bank, partially hidden by stalagmites, was a figure. It was Lucinda Harwell. She was alive. Lucinda sat cross-legged, her eyes closed, her hands resting on her knees. She wore the same simple clothes that the residents of Hollow Creek remembered, but there was something different about her, a stillness that went beyond mere repose. It was as if she were in a state between sleep and wakefulness. between this world and another. Thatcher called her name. Lucinda didn't answer. He called again, louder this time. Nothing. The three men carefully circled the lake, approaching her slowly. When they finally got close enough, Samuel reached out and gently touched her shoulder. Lucinda's eyes opened immediately. There was no confusion in them, nor surprise. It was as if she knew they were coming, as if she had been expecting them. She looked at each of the men, her gaze penetrating but not hostile, and then spoke in a voice that sounded distant, as if it came from far away. "You shouldn't be here." It wasn't a threat, but an observation. Thatcher tried to keep her voice steady when she asked where Margaret Foss was. Lucinda turned her gaze to the lake and, with a slow gesture, pointed to something beyond the water. On the other side, partially hidden by the rock formations, was another figure. It was Margaret. She was also sitting, in the same position as Lucinda, with the same expression of absolute tranquility. Peter ran around the lake and reached her. He checked her pulse, and to his relief she was alive. She was breathing slowly and regularly, but she didn't wake up, no matter how much he called her or gently shook her. Samuel turned his attention to Lucinda. He needed to understand. He needed to know what all this meant. In a calm voice, he asked what she was doing there, why she had brought Margaret, what this place was. Lucinda remained silent for a long moment, as if carefully choosing her words. Then she began to speak, and her story was as strange as the cave itself where they found themselves. She said that when she arrived in that valley years ago, she was running away from a life she didn't want, from decisions others had made for her. She had found the abandoned cabin and decided that it would be her refuge. But on the first night she had a dream. In the dream, an old woman visited her and showed her the mountain, the hidden cameras, the secrets kept for generations. In the following days, the dreams continued, becoming increasingly vivid. The woman taught her about the herbs that grew only in that valley, about the cycles of nature that governed those mountains, about the delicate balance that needed to be maintained. And she told her about the guardians, women who throughout the centuries had chosen to protect something precious. "Protect what?" Samuel asked, his voice echoing softly in the chamber. Lucinda gestured toward the lake. "Silence," she replied. "There's something down here that needs to remain asleep. I don't know exactly what it is. Those who came before me didn't know either. But we all feel its presence, we feel its weight, and we understand that our task is to keep watch." She explained that Margaret had come to her cabin, as she had done many times before, to seek medicine. But this time, Margaret was ill. It wasn't a physical illness, but a spiritual one. She was consumed by sadness she couldn't name, by a weight that kept her awake every night, unable to fall asleep again. Lucinda had brought Margaret to that place because here, deep in the mountains, there was something that calmed the mind, that brought peace to troubled spirits. "She's resting," Lucinda said simply. "For the first time in years, she's truly resting." Thatcher wasn't sure whether to believe that story. Part of him simply wanted to grab the two women and get out of there as quickly as possible. But another part, the part that had seen too many strange things during that investigation to simply ignore, hesitated. Then they heard it again. That sound Samuel had identified as breathing, that constant murmur coming from somewhere deeper. But now it was louder, more present, and for the first time, Samuel realized the sound wasn't coming from below, but from the lake itself. It was as if the waters were vibrating at a frequency his ears could barely detect. Lucinda closed her eyes again. "He's waking up," she murmured. "You disturbed him with your presence. You need to leave, now." There was no arguing with her. The urgency in his voice was undeniable. Peter took Margaret in his arms, lifting her with difficulty. She didn't wake up, but her body remained relaxed as if she completely trusted the person carrying her. The return through the chambers was hurried and tense. Peter carried Margaret with increasing effort, his boots occasionally slipping on the damp stones. Thatcher went ahead, his lantern swaying as he moved as quickly as the narrow passages allowed. Samuel came last, constantly looking back, hoping to see Lucinda following them. But she remained seated beside the lake, motionless like the mummified guardians they had encountered in the previous chamber. The sound continued to grow louder. It was no longer a distant murmur, but a palpable presence that seemed to make the very rock vibrate. Lanterns began to flicker, their flames dancing erratically, and small stones fell from the ceilings of the passageways. The entire mountain seemed to be awakening. When they finally reached the chamber where the other men were waiting, They found them in a state of barely contained panic. They too had felt the vibrations, heard the sounds coming from the depths. One of them had begun to climb the rope back to the surface without waiting for the others. Such was his urgency to get out of there. The ascent was chaotic. Margaret had to be carefully tied up and hoisted up, still unconscious but breathing normally. The men climbed one after the other, their hands scratching at the ropes, their feet seeking support on the crevice walls. When the last of them emerged to the surface, the sun was already beginning to set, tinging the sky with orange hues that contrasted sharply with the darkness from which they had come. Margaret was laid on a blanket that one of the men had spread on the floor. She began to stir, her eyes blinking slowly as if waking from a deep restorative sleep. When she finally focused her gaze and saw the faces around her, there was confusion in her expression, but also something more, a calmness that hadn't been present before. The lines of worry that normally marked her face seemed softened. The descent from the mountain to Hollow Creek was slow. Margaret insisted on walking, even though her legs were weak from days without proper movement. She couldn't remember much. There were fragments of memory, blurry images of lights reflecting on water, of sitting in absolute silence while something inside her calmed down. But the details were elusive, disappearing when she tried to focus on them. When they arrived at the village, it was already night. News of Margaret's return spread quickly. Her children ran to embrace her, tears of relief streaming down their faces. The women of Hollow Creek surrounded her, offering her hot tea and blankets, asking questions she couldn't answer satisfactorily. But the celebration was brief. There were still people missing. Jacob Turner, the hunter, remained at large, and Lucinda remained in the mountains deep within that impossible cave. Thatcher spent that evening talking with Samuel at Abigail Porter's boarding house. They were trying to make sense of what they had seen, of what Lucinda had told them. The deputy was a practical man, used to dealing with tangible crimes with understandable motives, but this was beyond his experience, beyond anything his years of law enforcement had prepared him to face. Samuel, on the other hand, found parallels in his research. He knew similar stories from other regions of the Appalachians, legends of guardians of ancient places, of pacts made between humans and forces that inhabited the land since before the arrival of Europeans. But he had always considered these stories folklore, metaphors to explain the inexplicable. Now he wasn't so sure. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Jacob Turner appeared at the edge of Hollow Creek, walking slowly along the main trail. He was dirty and obviously exhausted, but unharmed. When people rushed to meet him, Jacob told a strange story. He had gotten lost in the mountains during his hunt, injured his ankle in a fall and found shelter in a small cave. He had remained there for days, surviving on water from a nearby stream and the few provisions he carried. But the most peculiar part of his account was that, during the nights in the cave, he had heard voices, female voices that seemed to come from the very rock walls, singing in a language he didn't recognize, and in his dreams an old woman had visited him, showing him the way back home. When he woke up last morning, his ankle had improved significantly, and he knew exactly which direction to take to return to Hollow Creek. Jacob's description of the woman in his dreams was disturbingly similar to the mummified figures that Samuel, Thatcher, and Peter had found deep in the mountain. The same ancient clothes, the same serene expression, the same eyes that seemed to see through people instead of simply looking at them. In the following days, Hollow Creek slowly began to return to normal. Margaret returned to her home and children, resuming her daily tasks. Jacob recovered completely and promised his wife that he would never again hunt alone so far from the village. The conversations in the store gradually shifted, moving from the mystery of the caves to more mundane concerns such as the approaching winter and the need to stock up on provisions. But Samuel couldn't let the matter go. He spent weeks in Hollow Creek, reviewing his notes, studying Lucinda's notebook, trying to decipher the symbols he had seen carved into the rocks. He visited Margaret several times, carefully asking her what she remembered of her time in the caves. Margaret had few concrete answers to offer, but there was a change in her that everyone noticed. The melancholy that had haunted her for years had vanished. She slept soundly every night and woke up rested. She smiled more often. There was a lightness in her movements that hadn't existed before. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Thatcher eventually returned to Parksville, bringing with him Constance Vale's diary and his own notes on the investigation. He closed the case, classifying the disappearances as isolated incidents caused by disorientation in the mountains. Officially, Lucinda Harwell had chosen to remain in voluntary seclusion, and there was no crime to investigate. It was the simplest explanation, the one that would cause the least trouble for everyone involved. But Thatcher knew there was much more to the story than his official report suggested. At night, when he was alone in his office, he would often pick up Constance's diary and reread certain passages. There was something in that woman's words that haunted him, an unwavering certainty about her purpose that he secretly envied. In his world of law and order, everything was uncertain, everything was negotiable, but Constance had found something absolute, something that gave meaning to each day of her existence. Samuel remained in Hollow Creek until the beginning of December 1903. Winter arrived early in those mountains, bringing snow that covered the trails and made climbing to the upper valleys virtually impossible. He knew he couldn't return to Raven Rock until spring, and yet he wasn't sure if he should. Part of him felt he had already seen too much, learned things that perhaps weren't meant for men like him to know. Before leaving, Samuel climbed one last time to Lucinda's cabin. He didn't try to reach the caves, only visited the small log structure where it had all begun. The door was unlocked, swaying slightly in the cold wind. Inside, everything remained exactly as it had been when the first men had entered weeks ago. The wooden table with candle stains, the fireplace with old ashes, the shelves with carefully labeled herb pots. Samuel sat in the only chair and looked around, trying to imagine what Lucinda's life had been like there. The long winters alone, the silent nights with only the sound of the wind in the trees, the mornings spent gathering plants in the forest. There was a simplicity to that existence that he found both appealing and frightening. To live so detached from the world, so focused on a single purpose. He noticed something that had gone unnoticed before. On the wall beside the fireplace, almost invisible in the wood darkened by smoke, were carvings, names. Dozens of names, carefully engraved in the wood over many years. Samuel approached and ran his fingers over the letters. He recognized some of them from the stories he had heard in Hollow Creek. Constance Vale was there, and above her other names that probably belonged to the previous keepers. At the end of the list, just below Constance, there was an empty space. That was where Lucinda's name should have been, but she hadn't yet written it down. Or perhaps, Samuel thought, she was waiting until the end of her time as guardian to add her name to that lineage of women who had chosen such an unusual path. When Samuel finally left Hollow Creek, he took with him notebooks filled with notes, sketches of the symbols he had seen, and more questions than answers. He would visit other regions of the Appalachians over the following years, collecting similar stories, finding patterns that suggested a network of ancient knowledge stretching throughout the mountain range. On his travels, he would hear about other solitary women living in remote places, always in specific valleys or near unusual rock formations. Some were called healers, others witches, depending on who told the story. But they all shared certain characteristics. They knew the land in ways that others did not. They spoke of vigilance and balance. And when they disappeared, there was always another woman who eventually took their place. Life in Hollow Creek continued at its slow, predictable pace. The seasons changed, winter gave way to spring, and then to the summer of 1904. Margaret Foss raised her children, worked on her small property, and occasionally went down to the village to buy provisions. She never spoke of her time in the caves, and people eventually stopped asking. There was an unspoken agreement that certain things were better left unexplained. Jacob Turner returned to hunting, but now always in the company of other men and never straying far from the known trails. He completely avoided the region near the Lucinda Valley, making long detours when necessary. His wife Caroline noticed that he would sometimes wake in the middle of the night and sit on the porch, gazing at the dark mountains, as if expecting to see or hear something. But he never explained what he was looking for, and she had learned not to ask. Occasionally, hunters or travelers passing through the region reported strange lights in the mountains near Raven's Rock. They were described as bluish or silvery glows that moved among the trees, appearing and disappearing without any apparent pattern. Some said they were just reflections of the moon in quartz veins in the rocks. Others had no explanation to offer, only the certainty that they had seen something they couldn't understand. Lucinda's cabin remained abandoned throughout that year. Winter snow piled up on its roof, spring brought vines that began climbing the outer walls, and in summer birds nested under the eaves. Nature slowly reclaimed the structure, transforming it once again into part of the forest. But on an autumn morning in 1904, a year after the disappearances, something changed. One of Margaret's older sons, a young man named Daniel, was hunting rabbits in the hills when he saw smoke rising from the Lucinda Valley. It was a thin, steady line, the kind of smoke that comes from a well-maintained fireplace, not an accidental fire. Daniel ran back home and told his mother what he had seen. Margaret stood motionless for a long moment, gazing towards the distant mountains. Then, without a word, she prepared a basket with fresh bread, honey, and some vegetables from her garden. She told her children she would return before nightfall and began to climb the trail towards the valley. When Margaret arrived at the cabin, she found the door open and the interior clean and tidy. The fireplace was lit, warming the small space, and seated at the table, preparing herbs with precise and familiar movements, was Lucinda Harwell. The two women gazed at each other in silence for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the time measured by clocks. Margaret placed the basket on the table, and Lucinda nodded in thanks, a simple gesture but full of meaning. There was no need for words between them. Margaret had descended to those depths, had experienced the silence that calmed inner storms, and now understood things that had previously been beyond her perception. Margaret would visit Lucinda regularly over the following months, always bringing small offerings of food or fabric. She never stayed long, just long enough to ensure that the guardian of the valley had what she needed to survive the approaching winter. And Lucinda, in turn, would occasionally descend to Margaret's property to deliver medicine when one of her children fell ill, or to bring special roots that helped the crops grow stronger. A silent agreement was struck between Hollow Creek and the woman of the valley. She would be left in peace, and in return, she would continue her watchful work over something that no one truly wanted to understand. It was easier that way, simpler. Life in the mountains was hard enough without adding mysteries that couldn't be solved with tools or physical strength. Years passed. Samuel Harding eventually published his research on Appalachian folklore traditions in 1907, though he omitted many specific details about Lucinda and the caves beneath Ravenstone. He had vowed to himself not to expose those women to the scrutiny of curious individuals and academics who would not understand the delicate balance they maintained. His book only vaguely mentioned the existence of isolated healers and their botanical knowledge, without revealing the true nature of their role. Thatcher remained a deputy in Parksville until his retirement in 1915. He never again investigated mountain disappearances with the same intensity he had devoted to Lucinda's case. He had learned that not all mysteries needed or should be solved, that sometimes the answer was more disturbing than the question. On his last day as deputy, he burned his personal notes on the caves, watching the paper turn to ashes and smoke, rising towards the afternoon sky. Margaret lived until 1928, reaching the considerable age of 62. Her children grew up, married, and some remained in Hollow Creek, while others sought life in larger cities. She never told anyone, not even her own children, the full details of what she had experienced in those depths. But until the end of her days, she kept a small altar in her room. With candles and wildflowers she collected in the mountains, a practice that left her descendants curious but respectfully silent. Lucinda continued living in her valley for many years. Occasional travelers passing through the region would sometimes spot her gathering plants on the slopes, always alone, always silent. She aged as all people age, her hair darkening to silver, her posture stooping slightly under the weight of years. But her eyes retained that penetrating quality, that certainty of purpose that Samuel had noticed in their first encounter. Sometime in the 1920s, the occasional visits of Hollow Creek residents to Lucinda's cabin ceased, not by conscious decision, but simply because a new generation had grown up, a generation that didn't remember the events of 1903, and that saw the solitary woman of the valley only as an eccentric to be avoided. The stories were still told, but now as local legends, tales to frighten young people on stormy nights, not as vivid memories of something that actually happened. The cabin was eventually found empty in 1931. A hunter venturing into that valley for the first time in years discovered the door open, the interior meticulously organized, but with no sign of its occupant. The fireplace was cold, the herb shelves empty, and on the table lay only a single object, the notebook the men had found decades earlier, now even more filled with notes, symbols, and drawings. The hunter took the notebook to Hollow Creek, where it was examined by the few elders who still remembered Lucinda. They recognized her handwriting, but couldn't decipher most of its contents. It was as if, over the years, she had developed her own language, a way of recording knowledge not meant for ordinary eyes. A young woman from the village, whose name was Sarah Blackwood, asked to keep the notebook. She was known for her interest in medicinal plants and often spent days in the forests collecting spices and roots. The elders hesitated, but eventually agreed. There was something about Sarah that reminded them of Lucinda when she was younger, before the weight of vigilance had completely shaped her existence. Sarah spent months studying the notebook. At night, by candlelight, she traced the symbols with her fingers, trying to understand their meanings, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to understand. Not through reason or logic, but through a kind of instinctive recognition, as if the knowledge was already inside her, just waiting to be awakened. The following spring, Sarah moved into the cabin in the valley. She told her parents that she needed solitude to perfect her knowledge of plants, that life in the village was too hectic for the kind of work she wanted to do. They tried to dissuade her, but there was a determination in her eyes that clung to no argument. It was the same determination Lucinda had shown, the same that Constance had probably possessed before her, and so the cycle continued. A new guardian took the place of the previous one, maintaining a vigil that few understood, and even fewer questioned. The mountains guarded their secrets, the caves remained in their depths, and the delicate balance that had been maintained for generations remained intact. The following decades witnessed dramatic changes in the world beyond the Appalachian Mountains. World War I came and went, taking with it young men from Hollow Creek who would never return. The 1920s brought prosperity to some regions, while others remained trapped in old patterns of subsistence. Then came the Great Depression, plunging the country into hardship that made life in the mountains even more challenging than it already was naturally. But the valley where Sarah Blackwood now lived seemed to exist in a different temporal bubble. The economic storms that shook cities and towns passed by in the distance, like clouds that never reached that particular land. Sarah tended her medicinal herb garden, kept her cabin in order, and occasionally went down to what remained of Hollow Creek to trade medicine for basic provisions. The village had shrunk considerably. Many families had left in search of work in the industrial cities of the north, leaving behind empty houses and abandoned fields. Those who remained were mainly the elderly, those whose roots in that land were too deep to be uprooted by promises of a better life in distant places, and also some young people who, for reasons they themselves could not fully articulate, felt they belonged to those mountains in a way that transcended practical choices. Sarah rarely spoke about her work as a guardian. Even when she came down to the village, she kept conversations brief and superficial, never revealing the true nature of her responsibilities. But those who knew her well noticed changes in her over the years. There was a gravity in her presence, a depth in her gaze that hadn't existed when she was just a young woman interested in plants. It was as if she carried knowledge that weighed on her shoulders in invisible but very real ways. During the 1940s, while another world war ravaged distant continents, Sarah received occasional visitors in her valley. They were always women, arriving alone, guided by dreams or intuitions they couldn't explain. Some stayed only a few hours, sitting silently beside Sarah as she worked with her herbs. Others stayed for days, sleeping on the cabin floor, waking with a sense of renewal they hadn't experienced in years. Sarah never took them to the caves. She had learned through years of vigil that not everyone was destined to descend to those depths. Only a few truly needed to make that journey, those whose spirits were so fragmented that only the absolute silence of the subterranean chambers could restore them. For most, the mere presence in the valley was enough. There was something in the land itself, something in the waters that flowed through the streams, something in the air that blew through the ancient trees. That brought relief to weary souls. An interesting pattern emerged during those decades. Whenever there were major disturbances in the outside world, wars, economic crises, periods of profound social uncertainty, the number of visitors to the valley increased. It was as if, in moments of collective chaos, certain people were magnetically drawn to places of quietude and ancient stability. Sarah documented these visits in her own notebook, keeping simple but precise records that would eventually form a fascinating historical archive of the secret anxieties of a turbulent era. Sarah's botanical knowledge grew exponentially over the years. She not only mastered the techniques Lucinda had used, but developed new combinations, new ways of preparing remedies that were surprisingly effective. Occasional doctors who visited the region were amazed by the results she achieved using only plants and roots. Some tried to document her methods, but Sarah was careful to reveal only a portion of her knowledge, keeping secrets she considered too sacred to be shared indiscriminately. In 1952, something happened that would profoundly test Sarah's role as guardian. A group of government geologists arrived in the region to conduct studies on possible mineral deposits in the mountains. They were men of science, armed with modern equipment and detailed maps. They had identified the area near Raven Rock as potentially rich in certain strategic minerals and planned to carry out exploratory excavations. Sarah heard about it from one of Hollow Creek's last longtime residents, a man named Isaiah Colton, who vaguely remembered stories about Lucinda from when he was a child. Isaiah had come up to the valley specifically to warn Sarah, instinctively understanding that this modern intervention could disturb something that shouldn't be disturbed. For the first time in decades of vigil, Sarah descended from the mountains and went to Parksville. The city had grown considerably since Thatcher's days, with paved streets and multi-story buildings. She felt out of place there, a mountain woman in a world of concrete and cars. But her mission was clear. She needed to find those responsible for the mining project and convince them to abandon their plans. The geologists received her with condescending politeness. They listened to her concerns about disturbing the land, about the groundwater that could be contaminated, about the delicate balance of mountain ecosystems. But their expressions made it clear that they considered her words as the superstitions of a rural person without formal education. They had scientific data, government permits, schedules to meet. A lone mountain woman would not be an obstacle to national progress. Sarah returned to her valley knowing she would need a different approach. She spent sleepless nights studying Lucinda and Constance's notebooks, searching for knowledge that could help her, and she found something. Vague references to ways of amplifying the natural presence of the place, of strengthening what already existed in the depths of the earth. In the following months, Sarah performed tasks that no outside observer would understand. She traveled to Raven Rock regularly, carrying specific mixtures of plants that she burned in small fires around the rock formation. She spent entire nights sitting at the cave entrance, singing ancient melodies she had learned from notebooks, songs that did not belong to any known tradition, but seemed to resonate with the very structure of the mountain. When the geologists finally arrived to begin their exploratory excavations in September 1952, they encountered problems from day one. Their equipment malfunctioned for no apparent reason. Compasses spun wildly. Measuring instruments gave impossible readings, indicating magnetic fields that shouldn't naturally exist in that configuration. One of the men developed severe vertigo whenever he approached Raven Rock, a symptom that disappeared as soon as he moved away. Even more disturbing were the dreams. All the team members began having vivid nightmares during the nights they spent camped in the area. They dreamed they were buried alive, crushed under tons of rock. They dreamed of absolute darkness and a vast presence watching from deep within the earth. They would wake up sweating and trembling, unable to fall back asleep. After 3 weeks of failed attempts, the team leader made an unusual decision. He declared the area too geologically unstable for safe mining, citing risks of underground collapse and magnetic anomalies that could interfere with future operations. The project was officially cancelled, and the team left the mountains with a palpable sense of relief, though none of them could explain exactly why they felt so eager to leave. Sarah watched her departure from the balcony of her cabin. She felt no triumph, only a profound weariness. The effort to amplify the mountain's presence had taken its toll. She seemed to have aged years in a matter of months, but the balance was maintained, and that was what mattered. The years that followed the incident with the geologists brought a renewed quiet to the valley. Sarah continued her watchful work, but now with the full awareness that the modern world would eventually come knocking at the door of those mountains again. Progress was relentless, moving like a slow but steady tide, swallowing remote places and transforming them into domesticated versions of themselves. During the 1960s, while the country underwent cultural and social revolutions, the valley remained characteristically timeless. Sarah now had completely white hair, her face marked by deep lines that told stories of decades lived in contemplative solitude. Her hands, though still skilled with plants and preparations, showed the arthritis that comes with age and constant work in cold mountain climates. She began to worry about the succession. For years, Sarah had observed the few young women who still lived in the region, searching for signs of that indefinable quality that marked a potential guardian. But the new generation was different. They listened to transistor radios, dreamed of distant cities, talked about universities and careers that didn't exist in the mountains. The isolation that their grandmothers had accepted as natural now seemed like a prison they longed to escape. It was in 1967 that Sarah finally met someone. It wasn't a young woman from the village, but a middle-aged woman named Elizabeth Chen, who had arrived in the region completely unexpectedly. Elizabeth was originally from San Francisco, the daughter of Chinese immigrants, and had spent decades working as a nurse in busy urban hospitals. But something had broken inside her during the turbulent years of the decade, an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. She had left everything behind and simply started traveling east without a specific destination, following only an impulse she couldn't name. When Elizabeth arrived in the Appalachian Mountains, it was as if something inside her recognized that place. She rented a room in a boarding house on the outskirts of Parksville and began taking long hikes along the mountain trails, seeking a peace she had lost without knowing when. It was during one of these hikes that she found her way to Sarah's valley. The encounter between the two women was silent but profoundly significant. Sarah was in her garden when she saw Elizabeth emerge from the path, and something in her posture, in the way she moved through the landscape, told Sarah everything she needed to know. This was someone who understood, or at least had the capacity to understand, what it meant to keep watch over things the modern world preferred to deny. Elizabeth began visiting the valley regularly. Initially, she simply observed Sarah working, occasionally helping with simple tasks like harvesting plants or organizing dried roots. But gradually, Sarah began to teach, not only about botany and natural medicine, but about the history of the place, about the guardians who came before, about the responsibility that was both a privilege and a burden. Sarah never took Elizabeth to the caves during those early years. She remembered how Lucinda had prepared her, how knowledge needed to come gradually in layers, allowing each revelation to be absorbed before the next was presented. Revealing everything at once would be overwhelming, potentially destructive to a mind that was still learning to perceive realities beyond the ordinary. It wasn't until 1971, after 4 years of preparation, that Sarah finally led Elizabeth to Ravenstone. It was autumn again, the season that seemed to hold special significance in that place. The leaves on the trees were tinged with red and gold, and the air had that crystalline quality that comes before winter in the mountains. They descended together through the passages that Samuel, Thatcher, and Peter had explored decades ago. The ropes the men had used were gone, replaced by rudimentary ladders that Sarah had installed over the years to facilitate her periodic visits to the depths. The chambers remained essentially unchanged, the niches with their symbolic objects, the ancient paintings on the walls, the mummified guardians seated in their eternal vigil. Elizabeth absorbed everything in silence. She asked no questions, expressed no shock or fear. There was an acceptance in her posture that Sarah recognized, the same acceptance she herself had felt when she first understood the nature of her role. It was like finding something you always knew existed, but never had the words to describe. When they reached the final chamber, where the subterranean lake reflected their lanterns like a perfect mirror, Elizabeth sat on the edge, just as Lucinda had done so many years before. Sarah watched silently as the younger woman closed her eyes and simply existed in that space, allowing the profound silence of the chambers to permeate her being. They stayed there for hours. Sarah didn't keep track of time, knowing that deep in the mountains, ordinary concepts of minutes and hours lost their meaning. What mattered was allowing Elizabeth to fully experience that place, to understand viscerally why generations of women had chosen to dedicate their lives to protecting it. When they finally returned to the surface, the moon was already high in the sky. Elizabeth didn't speak of what she had experienced, and Sarah didn't ask. There was an understanding between them that transcended words. The succession was assured. When Sarah's time came, there would be someone to continue the watch. The 1970s brought further changes to the outside world. The environmental movement gained momentum, national parks were expanded, and there was a renewed interest in preserving wilderness areas. Ironically, this attention brought more people to the mountains, not fewer. Trails were officially marked, maps were published, and what was once territory known only to locals was now accessible to anyone with hiking boots and a tour guide. Sarah and Elizabeth worked discreetly to ensure that certain areas remained off these official maps. The valley and Raven Rock never appeared in any tourist publication, protected by a combination of confusing geography and, when necessary, subtle interventions that made trails seem impassable or simply uninteresting to casual explorers. In 1978, Sarah became seriously ill. It was pneumonia, complicated by decades of exposure to the damp cold of the caves and a constitution weakened by old age. Elizabeth cared for her in the cabin, using the remedies that Sarah herself had taught her to prepare, but both knew that the end was near. Sarah was 74 years old, a long life considering the circumstances of her existence. In the last weeks of her life, Sarah spoke more than she had in decades. She told Elizabeth stories that weren't in any notebook, knowledge passed down orally from guardian to guardian. She spoke of subtle signs in nature that indicated when the presence in the depths was restless, of how to interpret dreams that came during waking nights, of the importance of maintaining a balance between necessary isolation and sufficient connection with the outside world so as not to completely lose one's own humanity. Sarah passed away on a clear November morning, with Elizabeth sitting beside her. Her last words were simple: to keep watching, to keep maintaining balance, to keep honoring those who came before. Elizabeth buried her in a clearing near the cabin, marking the spot with a simple stone on which she carved only her name and years of life. There was no need for an elaborate epitaph. A lifetime's work spoke for itself. Elizabeth assumed the role of guardian with the same quiet seriousness as her predecessors. She brought her own perspectives to the job, her medical training allowing her to develop even more effective remedies, her urban experience giving her skills to navigate occasional interactions with authorities and unwanted visitors. But the core responsibility remained the same: to keep watch, to preserve the balance, to protect something ancient that still held relevance in a modern world that increasingly denied the existence of mysteries. Decades passed. The 1980s and 1990s brought technologies that would have seemed magical to Lucinda or Constance: cell phones, computers, the internet. But the valley remained fundamentally unchanged, a bubble of timelessness in a world of accelerated change. Elizabeth occasionally went down to nearby towns to buy supplies and stay minimally connected to contemporary developments, but her heart and her work remained in the mountains. She also meticulously documented everything. Her notebooks were more detailed than those of her predecessors, including precise sketches, scientific observations where applicable, and philosophical reflections on the nature of her role. Elizabeth understood that she was living in a time of transition, a moment when ancient knowledge needed to be translated into languages that future generations could understand, even if those generations grew up in a completely different world. When the new millennium arrived in 2000, Elizabeth was 61 years old. She began to think about succession, although she still felt capable of continuing for many years. But the lesson from previous guardians was clear: never wait until it's too late to find and prepare for the next one. The role was too important to be left to chance. She met someone under unexpected circumstances. A young ecology researcher named Maya Rodriguez had arrived in the region in 2003 to study biodiversity patterns in ancient mountain forests. Maya was meticulous in her scientific work, but she also possessed a sensitivity to aspects of nature that didn't easily fit into spreadsheets and academic reports. She noticed patterns that other researchers ignored, sensed connections that objective data didn't fully explain. Maya and Elizabeth's paths crossed when the young researcher accidentally stumbled upon one of the trails leading to the valley. Elizabeth, initially observing from afar, saw how Maya moved through the landscape, how she frequently stopped just to observe, how her eyes captured details that most modern people had lost the ability to perceive. They began to talk, initially about superficial subjects like weather patterns and plant species, but gradually, as trust grew, the conversations deepened. Elizabeth shared knowledge that wasn't in science textbooks, and Maya listened with an open mind that was rare in her generation. There was skepticism, certainly, but also a willingness to consider that perhaps there were aspects of reality that contemporary science didn't yet have the adequate tools to measure. Maya's preparations were only beginning when external circumstances once again threatened the valley's equilibrium. In 2005, a tourism development company announced plans to build a resort in the mountains, complete with cable cars, paved trails, and all the amenities modern tourists expected. The area identified for development included land near the valley and there were discussions about eventually expanding to include Raven Rock itself as a major tourist attraction. Elizabeth and Maya worked together to prevent this, combining old and modern approaches. Elizabeth used methods her predecessors had developed, working with the land and its depths to make the area less attractive for development. Maya used her scientific knowledge to document rare species and fragile ecosystems, building a formal case for environmental protection. The battle lasted 3 years. There were public hearings, environmental impact assessments, political lobbying from both sides. But finally, in 2008, the area was designated as a protected ecological reserve, officially preventing any commercial development. It was a victory, but also a reminder that each generation would face new challenges, new ways in which the modern world would try to penetrate and transform that ancient place. As these stories intertwine generations across centuries, from that distant autumn of 1903 to the present day, we are reminded that there are places in this world that hold memories deeper than official records can capture. There are traditions that persist, not because they are understood, but because they resonate with something fundamental in the human experience, our desire for connection with something greater than ourselves, our recognition that not everything can or should be explained, categorized, and domesticated. The Appalachian Mountains hold many secrets, forgotten valleys where time moves differently, caves that descend to depths never fully mapped, and stories, always stories, passed down from generation to generation, transforming slightly with each repetition, but keeping their essential core intact. If you've made it this far on this journey with us through the decades and lives of these extraordinary women, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories